How long does it usually take for them to come in?
They should be coming in now.
I don't see a list of anybody populating. Okay, Stephanie just replied.
Okay.
We don't have anybody yet, so.
Well, if nobody comes in, Eva, I still want to see what you put together with the data you've been working with, and I'll gladly show you what I have. So we can do it more relaxed, just back and forth.
We can. It's more like a Saturday morning coffee session.
All right.
I'm down for that. Or for me, Coke Zero, because I can't stand coffee.
Yeah, I still don't see anybody in the session yet.
Maybe they're not morning people like me.
Stephanie, do you see anybody yet? Two. All right. Two's good. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tommy Miller, for those of you who don't know and haven't met me before, and I'm here to introduce Eva Shipp, who has a Ph.D. and is an injury epidemiologist. Did I say that right?
Yep, perfect.
Who is interested in understanding motorcycle crashes and preventions. There's more in her biography if you choose to go look at it, and I'll turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be talking about high-risk riding behaviors in Texas and showing you some recent data. So first, I'm going to show you some data from just general injuries in motorcycle operators. Since this presentation is focused on behavior, I'm focusing on what the actual motorcycle operator is doing as opposed to a passenger. And sometimes I'm going to compare motorcycle operators to passenger vehicle drivers, just to make a couple of points. And then I'm going to focus in on 3 high-risk behaviors: speeding, impairment, and distraction. The data I'm using is from the Crash Records Information System here in Texas. We pulled the data very recently. It's only about a month old. And we are going to be using information from 2016 to 2020. Usually we try and present crash data for 3 to 5 years so that we can get some stable estimates and look at trends over time. And again, I'm focusing on the folks who are actually operating the motorcycle. And then for those of you who don't know about the Crash Record Information System, this is the crash report that the law enforcement officers complete when they respond to a crash. So I'm going to start off with just giving you some general information about how common injuries are in motorcycle operators in crashes. So sometimes when we talk about crash data, we present things about the whole crash, and sometimes we present information about the folks involved in the crash. So pretty much everything I'm showing you, again, is focused on the actual operator of the motorcycle. So this graph is presenting information from 2016 to 2020. I'm going to start off by saying that on average, there are about 6,500 motorcycle operators injured every year in Texas. And then a couple thousand more that are involved in crashes, but not injured or not recorded with an injury. And of those, about 450 are fatal, and another 1,700 or so every year are serious. I think this year we're up to about 459 fatalities in 2020. So the graph here is showing the percentage of each type of injury across those 5 years. The first bar are people that died. So about 5% of operators in crashes were fatally injured. The next bar is about 20 to 24% are sustain a suspected serious injury. About another 36% have a suspected minor injury, followed by, which is our largest group, followed by about 23% possible injury, and about 15% were not recorded with an injury. About 28% of operators in crashes sustain that fatal or suspected serious injury. That is a very, very large proportion. Males tend to experience more severe injuries than females, and older folks, they are known to take more risks. And then older folks also tend to sustain more severe injuries, largely due to the fact that our bodies over time as we age become more frail, less resilient to an impact. So just to put things in perspective, I just told you that about 28% of our operators sustain those fatal or serious injuries. Just to give you an idea, folks in passenger vehicles also die and sustain serious injuries, but the proportion of those in crashes is only around 1 to 2%. Far fewer folks are sustaining those more serious injuries in vehicles, and it makes sense. Vehicles have protection around them, and then motorcycles are more exposed. So now I'm going to present the rest of my presentation is going to focus on those specific behaviors. So we're going to start off with one of my favorites, speeding. When we look at speeding, and I will tell you the way we define speeding, for those of you who want to know, is it's the officer coded them as speeding over the limit or unsafe for conditions. And of all motorcycle riders involved in crashes, about 12% are coded as being speeding related, compared to only about 2 to 3% of passenger vehicle drivers. It's slightly higher. Males tend to be coded more often as being involved in a speeding-involved crash, and slightly higher among younger folks. So here's where it gets really interesting from a traffic safety perspective. We see that about 45% of those operators with speeding as a contributing factor to the crash, they were the one coded that way, not the whole crash. We know it was the motorcycle operator. They sustained a fatal or serious injury, compared to only about a quarter of the folks who were non-speeders. And then you might be wondering what happens when we mix speed and curves. Curves are lots of fun and they're pretty, but half of those speeding operators that crashed on a curve. So about half of those folks coded as speeding crashed on a curve, compared to only 14% of folks who were not speeding. So then this graph I find quite interesting. It's looking at speeding among motorcycle operators who crashed on a curve and by age. So as you can see, the proportion of operators who were speeding who crashed on a curve increased quite linearly as we saw increases in age. So for example, almost 70% of operators in that 65 plus category who were speeding, they had their crash on a curve or curve related. And this could be because of two reasons. One, for some reason, older folks might be more likely to ride on curves, but they also, and folks who are more experienced than myself with the older rider community, anecdotal evidence suggests that older riders may tend to ride Goldwings or larger bikes that maybe are more difficult to manage on a curve at a high speed. We know as we age, our reaction speeds are slower, coordination is impacted, and vision is also impacted. When we look at some of the protective behaviors like helmet use and licensing and license endorsements, about 53% of speeding operators did not have an M license, compared to about 45% of non-speeding operators. So a slightly higher percent of speeders also didn't have an M endorsement. But when it came to helmet use, there was pretty much no difference between speeders and non-speeders. Both groups were about 39% or 38% were not wearing a helmet when they crashed. So another high-risk behavior in both motorcycles and passenger vehicles is impairment. And impairment here, it's the broad definition of impairment. It's not just being above the legal limit blood alcohol level of 0.08. This is impairment by alcohol or drugs, and evidence of alcohol in the system. Oops, I went too far. So about 6% of operators in crashes were impaired, compared to about half of that, 3% of passenger vehicle drivers are coded as impaired for any crash severity. This is slightly higher above old folks in the 34 to 55 year age group. It's actually the highest age category for impairment riders, and higher in males, with about 6% for males and about 2.6% for females. And I will say, overall, there's far more, the proportion of operators in crashes are largely male. So about 63% of impaired operators had a fatal or serious injury, compared to only about 25% of folks who are not impaired. That's quite a difference. When we look at motorcycle operators and impairment, so the impaired operators are about over twice as likely to be in a speeding related crash. So impairment and speeding don't mix very well. And about half of all impaired operators run off the road, compared to about only 21% of non-impaired. When we look at those two protective behaviors for M license, 58% of impaired operators did not have an M license, compared to 45% of folks who were not impaired. And helmet use, there's quite a differential. 62% of impaired operators were not wearing a helmet versus 37% of non-impaired folks not wearing a helmet. And finally, our third behavior we're going to talk about today is distraction. And this one is a little bit different than the two other behaviors, impairment and speeding. So here, motorcycle riders are there's a lower proportion that are coded as distracted when we compare them to passenger drivers. So 8% versus 11%. When we look at whether or not distracted drivers are fatal or seriously injured, it's about the same proportion. 27% of distracted operators have those more severe injuries, and it's the same proportion for folks that are non-distracted. I want to caution and say this may not be actual reality. Rather, could be a reflection of the fact that it's very difficult to code or identify distraction in a crash. Unlike when an officer comes on the scene, it's much more easier to identify an impaired driver, or blood tests are done, especially in fatal crashes. It's much harder to code or identify distraction in general, not just for motorcycle operators, but in general for police officers. But we see that 32% of distracted operators run off road, compared to only 22% of the ones who are not distracted. And logically, intuitively, that makes sense. When we look at the two protective behaviors, about 45% of distracted operators didn't have their M license. It's about the same proportion for folks who are not distracted. And when we look at helmet use, there's not really a relationship between coded distraction and helmet use, with both groups hovering around 40% not wearing a helmet. So what you might be thinking, okay, fine, Eva, what are kind of the gist or the overall take-home points of everything that you just presented? Well, some of the risk behaviors tend to cluster. We see that speeding clusters with impairment, no M endorsement, and helmet use. Speeding and impairment are more common among our motorcycle operators than passenger vehicle drivers. And these behaviors, we know, increase injury severity in motorcycle operators, but also passenger vehicles. We know that speeding and curves do not mix, and that our older operators may be at a particularly high risk for these types of crashes. We know that impairment increases the risk of speeding-related crashes, run-off-road crashes, and those protective behaviors are less likely, wearing the helmet and the M license endorsement. And distraction is less of an issue in motorcycle riders, perhaps because it's just much harder to operate a vehicle and be on your phone or doing other things than in a passenger vehicle. But it still happens, and it may be underestimated, like I said, because it's really hard for the cops to identify that. It's not associated with increased, it's not increased with increased severity or other factors, but it is associated with those run-off-road crashes. And that's what I have for y'all today.
Eva, we got a couple questions that
Okay.
came for you from Chris. Are the fatality and injury statistics for on-road and off-road or just on-road?
So it would have to be associated with the on-road public road. So if they could be on the road to start with and run off-road, they'd be included here. But if they were just off-road motorcycling or dirt biking, they wouldn't be included here.
Awesome. Hopefully that answers Chris' question. And the second one, in talking with the statistics about curves for at night, are they more due to impairment or higher speeds?
Oh, that's interesting. I can run that. If somebody, I have the data right in front of me. If somebody wants to tell me who they are, I can get that statistic in the next few minutes.
That is Chris I don't even know how to say that, brother. I'm sorry. I don't want to butcher your name. If you look in the QA on the side there, you'll see Chris.
I'll find it. Okay, thank you.
And that's all the questions for Eva. Next up, we have Mike McCall, who works for Virginia Tech, and he is a researcher associated with the Motorcycle Research Group and Center for Data and Analytics, and his focus is on human psychology with an emphasis on vision and driving. Take it away, Mac.
All right, let my screen get loaded up here. So thank you for the introduction, Tommy. As Tommy said, I'm Mac McCall, and I do motorcycle work at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. What we're going to be talking about today is an on-road study that we did a couple years back and have been analyzing the data ever since, where we took 100 riders, sponsored by the Motorcycle Safety Foundation, where we took 100 riders, put some stuff on their bike, and looked at the data as they came in. So the MSF 100, as the name implies, was 100 motorcycle riders, 72 of which were male, with of course the remaining 28 then being female, who we sought out. They had their personal motorcycles instrumented with our equipment, and they stayed in the study from anywhere from 2 months to 2 years. The majority of the riders were in the study for right around 1 year. The data were collected August 2011 through December 2013, and we really tried to go for a large breadth of kind of rider types. And so in doing so, we sampled across different age ranges. So here from 21 to having a participant that turned 80 while they were in the study, and across different motorcycle types. So one nice thing about doing 100 riders is breaking things into percentages just gets really simple. So the sample was 41% touring bikes, 38% cruisers. Now this could be anywhere from a 250cc starter bike up to much larger cruisers, of course touring being a bagger type. And then sport bikes ranging from, I think we had a couple in the 300cc range, but up to 1200cc. So this slide has a lot going on and a lot of text. Really what we're showing here is what did we record? So from every ride, from the moment the rider went out there and key on, turning on the key, once it hits that accessory position, turns on our data recording equipment, which consisted of 5 cameras. After the fact, we looked at lane position, We had accelerometers, gyros, forward radar, speed, turn signals. We could look at the brake lever inputs, their position. And as we mentioned, the data were collected continuously. And then the cellular communication is just referring to the fact that for the motorcycles, if something was going wrong with their data acquisition system, or there was some reason to alert VTTI, hey, you need to go back and pay attention to this bike, maybe the hard drive's getting full because they're a prolific rider, then it would let us know, and we could send a tech out there and get it looked at. If we look at the figure on the right, we see the US with 4 circles and a whole bunch of squiggly lines. The squiggly lines are actual GPS traces of trips that our riders took over the course of the study. So we had one riding population based right around Blacksburg, Virginia. We had Orlando, Florida, Southern California, right around Irvine, and then this little kind of reverse pit to the olive here is a pocket of sport bike riders that we recruited out of Phoenix, Arizona. And the reason I like this plot is because it shows that this isn't just a situation where we recruited people that weren't riding that much, or we recruited people that kind of stayed in a small location, but rather we were going for a wide breadth of riders. You can see we had somebody that went out and did the Sturgis ride up to Devil's Tower out of Virginia, a couple cross-country rides out of Florida, and the same out of our California group. So when we look at how much participants rode when they were in the study, we did get about 366,000 miles of continuous data that we collected over about 9,000 hours in saddle. Our average rider was slightly over the national average with 4,300 miles per year, but it ranged from one guy who logged 90 miles over the course of a year up to 16,000 for one of our more prolific riders. And the average trip fits right in with kind of what you would expect, and along the lines similar to what we would see with car drivers, of just under 12 minutes and over 12 miles and over 18 minutes, with no real difference in the trip duration and the trip distance based on how often you rode. Now, how often we ride kind of comes to that figure that is on the right here. And I like this one because for me, this really shows the 3 types of riders that are out there. So a green, like a fluorescent green box shows that, hey, look, there's at least one trip that was recorded on that calendar day. And so we have month and year, that's on kind of our Y here. And we have day of week starting with Sunday and ending on Saturday, that's on our X-axis. So if we look at this participant right here, we see this is somebody that uses their bike for commuting, we could presume. That they're on the bike pretty much every day of the week with a few breaks in between. Although they typically, if they're going to take a day off, they do it on Sunday. If we move over to the middle figure, we see kind of our stereotypical weekend rider. And if there's a Saturday or Sunday and it's not in the wintertime, it's likely that they're going to be found on their bike at some point. However, the one thing we can take home from this rider is they really have something against riding on Tuesdays. That's the only day of the week that they didn't cover over the course of their participation at some point. And the third rider type, I think that if we can't relate to it personally at some point in our riding lifetimes, then we can definitely think of people that can. I get on the bike when I can. I throw on my gear, I start it up, and a few times a year, I'll be able to hop on and go for a ride. Of course, for this participant, it was as long as that's not on a Wednesday. Those slides are just to kind of give an overview of what the data are that generated the crash data that we're going to be looking up here in the next few slides. First, I want to get a couple definitions out of the way. So when we talk about crash, what are we talking about? We're talking about any part of the bike or rider coming in contact with the ground that's not supposed to. So, this isn't a foot down, this is the side, or just a peg hitting the ground. This is the bike going down, or also a non-premeditated roadway departure. So this is actually leaving the pavement and going into the rocks. When we use the term near crash, this is a crash would have happened if one of the actors involved didn't act quickly in order to avoid a crash. So with rapidity is the phrase we use there. And then we'll see, or you'll at least hear me say the acronym CNC, which just means crash or near crash. So overall, what did we see? Well, we saw that overall we had at least 55 riders that had at least one crash or near crash that we detected over their participation. That averages out to 1.5 per rider. We obviously had some riders that had more, some riders that had less. And just because a rider might have had more in the number of crash near crash events didn't necessarily make them our more dangerous riders, because we try and look at things where we can as a rate. So how many crashes or near crashes they have per mile of participation. And overall, we find that, our riders had about just under one per every 1,000 crash or near crash per 1,000 miles they travel. So that means if we're traveling 3,000 miles per year, we would expect that between 2 and 3 times during that year, you might have a close call. But what's interesting is when we look at the close calls and who's having them, in driving, there's kind of the 80-20 rule that 20% of the drivers out there account for 80% of the risk that's out there. And that's why our insurance goes up. When we have a close call, or we actually have to use the insurance in the first place, it's because with the math that they're doing on their end, they're saying, okay, well, this person has had one crash, so they're probably going to have another crash. And we see very similar things, or saw very similar things in the MSF 100 data set, where roughly 25% of our riders were accounting for almost 75% of our risk. And that goes up to 30% of our riders were accounting for 85% of our risk, which, in a statistical means would come down to that kind of 80-20. But now we're going to move on to, okay, so that's how many they had. That's interesting. That's statistics, and it's a useful nugget. But what did you actually see? So the first thing we're going to look at is I'm going to throw a wall of text at you with a lot of numbers. We're going to go through every one of them line by line. Either that or there's just a couple of high points I want to hit. And what we see is that the single most common type of near crash that we had in the MSF 100 data set proved a surprise to us, and I think relates to the 8% distracted number that Eva brought up when it came to crash statistics themselves. And that is the most common type of crash that we almost get into as riders is nearly running into the vehicle in front of us. That's followed by sideswipe in the same direction. As you saw earlier, we do have some of our sample in California where sideswipe, it's kind of there moving into a lane on a rider, can actually be moving into a part of the lane that a rider is occupying with you. Ground impact, low speeds, followed by the curve negotiation, again in line with the numbers that Eva was presenting us. Coming in on third place is for crashes and near crashes, about 5 or 6% of what we observed was the other vehicle turning across the rider's path. And that's kind of interesting that it's that far down, in that in the rider safety community, and as riders obviously diligent about our own safety, that left turn across path, that's the one that always gets our attention. That's the one that always stands out in our mind. And we do see them just further down than what we would expect as riders. If we look at only the crash data, what do we see? So we're saying here that, okay, well, near crashes are informative, but maybe the crashes themselves are more interesting. What do those numbers look like? And what we see, and this is not surprising, the most common crash type we see, or something that's not supposed to hit the ground, is what I refer to colloquially as the quicker I pick the bike back up, the less this just happened type of crash. And that was 56%, 57% of all the crashes we observed were the low speed ground impact. That's followed by road departures. Then we get down to 3 other vehicle turning across path crashes. We have 2 situations where the motorcycle rear-ended the vehicle in front of them. The ground impact while underway, a low side, followed by poor curve negotiation. We did have 1 rider that did get rear-ended during their participation in the study. They were fine, miraculously stayed on the bike. It was really quite an interesting thing to see while they were stopped at a stop sign or stoplight. Then other vehicle straight across path, and then the other vehicle turning into the path of our rider. So on this next slide, we see that number one crash type is ground impact, low speed. And we all know what it looks like to tip over or drop or ground impact, low speed, depending on what you want to do. But one thing that I want to show here is there's a lot that can be learned from what we as riders often think of as not a big deal, even though it can cause property or personal damage in some situations. So first I'm going to play this video straight through, and then we'll look at closer at what's going on. And down. So one thing to point out right there at the end, it was that kind of nice slow descent, that whole, hey, I'm going to stick my leg down and try and catch it, and if I can stop it, I can stop it, and you hit that tipping point and it goes to the ground. Let's watch it this time and kind of see what might have been going on in the rider's world as they approach the stop sign. Oops. Sorry. So first off, we're coming up, and what we'll notice is that we're slowing down, and we definitely can stop at the stop sign, but we're probably considering, if I don't have to put my foot down, I'm not going to put my foot down, and we're going to come to a close enough stop and keep going through. Known in some areas as the California roll. So what we also notice is that as we're scanning the intersection to see what's coming, we notice a box truck that's going to be coming up on our left. And so we're going to want to keep an eye as a rider on this box truck to see what's going on. So the box truck's out of our view, and we actually have camera views that are looking at the left and right hand. And from there, I can tell you that the box truck is now turned on its turn signal, and the truck is going to turn up the road that we're going down. So from the rider's perspective, okay, well, the box truck was my primary threat. That primary threat is no longer there. In the logic of doing the California roll, we're going to continue. So we're still going, we're starting to turn front handlebars, but right as, and it keeps trying to skip over on me. But right as we get to that point, what we notice is the box truck was actually obscuring other traffic. And every time I go to pause, so I apologize for that. One more time. This time we're not going to pause, we're just going to let it go through. Box truck is turn signal on, box truck is turning. We find out that it's obscured. We grab a fistful of front wheels cocked, and we go down. So the video is just in there to show, A, there's a lot that can be learned, and B, what not to do when coming up on a stop sign, always plan to stop. The name of this session is Scenarios with Increased Crash Risk, and so I just want to go through a couple of those that we did observe. First off, when we're riding down the road, what we see is, if you look at a comparison between, all right, I'm around an intersection with other traffic, there's no stop signs or stoplights that are controlling it, what happens to our crash risk? What we see is that crash risk increases 40 times in those uncontrolled intersections. So the take home to riders there is to, even if you don't have a stoplight or a stop sign, look out for that other guy who might, because they might not be paying attention. We see parking lots and driveways posing a significant threat at a 9-fold increase in crash risk. Even traffic signals, we see a 3-fold increase in crash risk. But now we start getting into the rider behavior aspects of things. And this, again, gets interesting. So aggressive riding increases crash risks by 18 times. And it's really easy to say, well, if you're riding aggressively and you're riding like an irresponsible road user, then of course your crash risk is going to increase, and it's going to be a significant increase. And then we see under that, again, not surprising. If I don't know what I'm doing or I'm not paying attention, of course my crash risk is going to increase. About 9-fold in this case. And keep in mind that what Eva pointed out was 8% of riders in these serious crashes are distracted. So that's 8% with a 9-fold increase, assuming that nothing else bad is going on, no other adverse behaviors are going on the part of the rider. But what surprised us and what's interesting here is that bad behavior is additive. That is, if you're coming at it and you're riding aggressively and you're inattentive, or you're riding aggressively and maybe your skills aren't where they should be for a particular section of road or a particular ride, that we see that crash risk increase, sorry about that, go up 30-fold. So the more bad behaviors you have going on at once, linearly speaking, the more at risk for a crash you're going to be in a certain situation. And then in line with what we see with federal data, we see right-hand curves posing a problem with a 2-fold increase in crash risk over riding straight for riders. But both the federal data and our data, of course, Eva presented some fantastic curve data. We want to understand a little bit more what are our riders doing in curves. So we decided to look specifically at curves, and we found that overall riders 3 times more likely to be involved in a crash or near crash in a curve than a straight road segment, still in line. But one of the things that we noticed as we were going through the videos that came up consistently was when we were seeing the most issues, there were other riders around ours. So cutting up the twisties in California or Virginia or Florida doesn't really have many. What we experienced, it was these group rides where riders were 15 times more likely to be involved in a crash or near crash event than they were even on that same roadway when they were riding solo, with kind of a suggestion and reinforcement of ride your own ride. Another thing we wanted to look at was start kind of teasing out some of the differences between cars and motorcycles. So we took a car naturalistic study, big one, it's called Shipp 2, 3,500 drivers all around the country. And we compared the braking and crash near crash situations to the braking and crash near crash situations in the MSF 100. And what we found was almost across the board, riders don't brake as hard as car drivers in emergency and critical situations. And when we break that out to individual crash and near crash types, we see the same thing with one exception. And that one exception is that when the other vehicle is making that left turn across path, riders appear to be braking on par with car drivers. So just to break everything down to one slide and give a couple take homes, to the riders out there, don't be your own worst enemy. One thing we did find is riders had more single vehicle crashes and near crashes than they did crashes and near crashes involving another guy. We found that low speed ground impact, most common crash type, and there is a lot that can be learned from those. Ride your own ride. If you're with one or more other riders through curves, the risk of crash or near crash increases 15-fold. So don't worry about slowing down the group, because it's going to slow down the group a heck of a lot more if you have to stop and pick up your bike or worse than it is just to slow down. And the other thing to point out there, if you can't spot the person in the group ride that's having troubles, then you might want to take a look in the mirror. Give plenty of space to the vehicle in front of you. Most common near crash type was the rear-ending traffic ahead. Of course, always watch out for the other guy's intersections. You're not as agile as they think you are. So just keep in mind that in the emergency situations, especially if you're a non-rider out there, that you might think that smaller vehicle can come to a stop a lot quicker because we know they can accelerate quicker in the majority of situations. But deceleration is a different animal. Deceleration is a lot more complicated on a motorcycle, and they're not going to be able to come to a stop as quick as you think they can. And then if you had one crash or near miss recently, you might want to hit up the parking lot, might want to seek out a little bit of training, and you might want to brush up on your skills, because you might be part of that 25% of riders that end up being 75% of the risk. And more than happy to take questions now if we have any time.
All right. Thank you, Mac. We've got a few questions for you.
Okay.
Chris would like to know if you have any of the individual behavioral characteristics of the 29% of high frequency riders. So the people that ride all the time, what are their bad behavior characteristics?
So we didn't split out and look at kind of the bad behavior, individual bad behavior characteristics statistically. I can tell you just from looking at some of the data, a few of them tend to be kind of the more aggressive type of rider. But a lot of it's just kind of the situations that riders tend to put themselves in from one time or from one time to the next that might kind of increase those crash risks. Maybe they're speeding more, maybe they're out there more, on the curvy roads where that single vehicle accident is more likely to happen. Or one of the things we see is the more traffic that's around, the more likely it is that you're going to interact with that traffic, right? That's pretty straightforward. And so people that are in dense traffic or kind of accordion traffic all the time do tend to have more crashes and more near crashes at least than riders that spend most of their time kind of out in the open road, if you will.
So you're saying it's more circumstantial than it is individual skill level?
It's a combination. I mean, honestly, it's a combination of both. And to speak conclusively on it, I can say overall it's circumstantial. So overall, we see more accordion type behavior, or overall, we might see, more aggressive type riding. But to take it down to the individual level, unfortunately, we haven't done any of those analyses just because it's difficult to show that. Yeah, we just haven't done many of those analyses.
Gotcha. James Hansen was wondering if there's absolutely zero animal-involved crashes in the MSF 100 study.
There were zero animal-involved near crashes. There were several animal-involved crashes. We did have several animal-involved near crashes. A couple different deer encounters. One encounter with a family of ducks where the rider had to brake hard to avoid hitting a mama duck, which was an interesting choice. We had a near crash that actually involved a rider braking hard to avoid a squirrel, which goes 100% against when I was coming up, a rider coach teaching me if you can eat it in one sitting, go ahead and hit it.
Okay.
But no crashes, plenty of near crashes.
Gotcha. Chris De La Plaine was wondering what percentage of these were considered to be ideal conditions.
So if we take ideal conditions to be good road surface, good weather, then I don't have a specific percentage for you. It's the majority. I can tell you on the curve analysis, when I did that, all of it was ideal conditions.
Gotcha. And evidently I misinterpreted his question. He was looking for the characteristics of riders who crash more than others, age, experience, etc.
So age was not found to be a significant predictor of crash risk. We did find that our novice riders were more likely than our more experienced riders to be involved in a crash or near crash. We also looked at bike type, but that was inconclusive. I don't have exact numbers for you right now, and I apologize for that, but those are the general trends in the data that we saw.
Gotcha. Right on. Thank you, Mac. I appreciate your time. I have one follow-up question for Eva, if she's still on.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Gotcha. The question was asked by Chris. Can you advise what elements the police consider as distracted?
So the way it's coded on the crash report, there's, of course, it's distraction by cell phone or mobile device, driver inattention, or distraction in vehicle. So those are like the pre-coded choices. And so they may not be totally, the types of distractions that motorcycle riders might have.
Gotcha. So it's not really broke out with distracted by cell phone or distracted by, eating food or something.
Right. They have recently, in the most recent years, broken it out by cell phone, but not by things like having a hamburger in one hand and those type of more specific details you might find in the narrative when the cop writes out it kind of what happened in his or her own words. Gotcha.
Are there any other questions for Eva or Mac? Or any questions that I haven't gotten to yet? I don't see anything popping up here. How are we on time? We seem to be good on time. Here we go. All right. I'd like to take this opportunity again to close out and thank Mac and Eva for sharing with us. Your information, contact information is in the biographies that people can look up if they have follow-on questions. Do you have any closing comments from either one of you?
It was a pleasure to be here with everybody this morning.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I appreciate the invite, and hopefully people got something new to take home.
Right on. All right. I'm not really sure how to close this out. We just end it? I don't know how that works. Here we go. All right.
Well, cool. Thanks, guys.